If you get rich, tell no one. Wealth, when spoken loudly, invites attention. But attention is rarely neutral. Throughout history, the most powerful figures understood something subtle about human nature. People are not disturbed by wealth itself, but by visible power. Money displayed openly can awaken quiet emotions in others: envy, resentment, suspicion. And once those emotions awaken, influence begins to erode. This is why the true elite rarely move like the rich portrayed in movies. They do not decorate their lives with noise. They practice something quieter, a form of psychological invisibility. Centuries ago, the political thinker Machiavelli observed this pattern among rulers and powerful families, not as morality, but as strategy. Because the moment wealth becomes a spectacle, it stops being protection and starts becoming a target. And the most powerful people in history have always known one thing: power survives best when it looks ordinary. Machiavelli spent years observing rulers, courts, and fragile governments. In those environments, survival depended less on morality and more on perception. Visible wealth sends a message. Sometimes it signals success, but often it signals distance. Distance between ruler and citizen. Distance between privilege and struggle. Machiavelli understood that people tolerate power more easily when it feels close to them, when it appears familiar. A ruler who dressed too extravagantly risked awakening suspicion. A prince who displayed too much luxury could seem detached from the people whose loyalty he required. Because when wealth becomes theatrical, it transforms perception. It stops looking like stability. It begins to resemble excess. And excess is rarely forgiven for long. Throughout history, the most enduring figures of influence practiced restraint. Their wealth existed, but it was rarely the center of attention. Their environments were controlled. Their image is carefully balanced between strength and humility. Not invisible, but never overwhelming. This quiet balance created something powerful: comfort. People are less threatened by power when they cannot fully see it. When influence blends gently into the background, it avoids triggering the instincts that lead to rebellion or resentment. In this way, silence becomes a language. Not the silence of weakness, but the silence of control. The kind of control that understands something ancient about human nature. Power displayed too brightly can blind others, but power held quietly can endure. When wealth is seen too clearly, it becomes a mirror, and mirrors force comparison. Machiavelli recognized this emotional mechanism centuries before modern psychology described it. In the political world, he observed, rulers did not fall simply because they were powerful. They fell when their power began to provoke resentment. Human beings rarely measure their lives in isolation. Instead, the mind quietly compares. It compares houses, clothing, opportunities, and especially wealth. The moment someone's prosperity becomes visible, it enters a social equation. People begin asking silent questions. Why them? Why not others? How did they get it? At first, these questions may appear harmless. Sometimes they even carry admiration. But admiration is fragile. Under the right conditions, it slowly transforms. Psychologists have long observed that visible inequality can awaken a powerful emotion: envy. Not always the loud, hostile kind, but a quieter form that hides behind judgment, suspicion, and moral criticism. A prince who lived in extreme luxury risked awakening something dangerous in the population: the belief that their suffering existed to sustain his comfort. And once that belief begins to spread, loyalty becomes unstable. Because envy rarely stays personal, it slowly becomes political. A noble house too proud of its fortune might find itself surrounded by quiet enemies. A ruler too eager to display riches could unintentionally create the impression of greed, even if the wealth had been earned, even if it had been inherited. Perception does not care about fairness. It cares about emotion. This is why Machiavelli advised rulers to avoid appearing greedy extravagant, or disconnected from the lives of ordinary people. Not because wealth itself was wrong, but because visible wealth could ignite feelings that no army could easily control. Once envy begins to circulate through a society, it changes the atmosphere. Respect begins to weaken, suspicion begins to grow, and slowly, the powerful discover a truth that has repeated itself across centuries. The more people see your wealth, the more they begin to imagine taking it. Machiavelli understood that the stability of a ruler depended on reputation. Not reputation in the modern sense of popularity, but the deeper emotional image people carried in their minds. A ruler had to appear capable. He had to appear disciplined. And most importantly, he had to avoid appearing greedy. Greed was dangerous, not because wealth itself threatened a state, but because the appearance of greed made people feel exploited. Once a population begins to believe its ruler lives for luxury, loyalty begins to fracture. The ruler may still hold power, but the psychological bond begins to weaken. And without that bond, authority becomes fragile. So Machiavelli advised something subtle. A prince should possess wealth, but not advertise it. He should maintain power, but not parade it. Luxury could exist behind palace walls, but in public, restraint mattered. People needed to believe their ruler valued stability more than indulgence. They needed to see discipline instead of excess. Because visible extravagance sends a message even when no words are spoken. It suggests distance. Distance between the ruler and the lives of ordinary people. And distance, once felt too strongly, slowly transforms into distrust. Machiavelli's advice was never about morality. It was about survival. A wise ruler allowed wealth to remain partially hidden, like a foundation beneath a building, strong enough to support the structure, but rarely visible from the outside. In this way, power became quieter, less provocative, less threatening, because the moment power begins to look indulgent, people begin to imagine replacing it. Visibility is a strange kind of vulnerability. The more people see, the more they interpret. And interpretation often creates stories that were never intended. A luxurious house becomes a symbol of arrogance. An expensive car becomes evidence of greed. Even silence can be misunderstood as pride. The powerful have always lived under the weight of perception. Every visible detail becomes a signal. And Machiavelli understood something subtle. The safest signals are often the quietest ones. To appear ordinary is not always a sign of modesty. Sometimes it is a strategy. Throughout history, many influential families practiced a form of social camouflage. Their wealth existed in land, trade networks, investments, and political alliances. But their daily appearance rarely reflected the full scale of their resources. Not because they lacked confidence, but because invisibility creates safety. Attention attracts questions. Questions attract scrutiny. And scrutiny eventually attracts resistance. A person who appears too powerful becomes a focal point. People begin watching more closely. Motives are examined. Every action is interpreted through suspicion. But when influence moves quietly, it rarely triggers alarm. The person who blends into the background is rarely seen as a threat. This is the invisible armor Machiavelli's philosophy quietly implies. Not armor made of weapons or armies, but armor made of perception. If power looks ordinary, it rarely provokes hostility. If wealth appears moderate, it rarely inspires resentment. And if influence remains subtle, it can operate freely. Modern society often celebrates visibility. Social media rewards display, recognition, and spectacle. But true power has never relied on spectacle. Spectacle invites attention, and attention invites challenges. So the most enduring forms of influence rarely look dramatic from the outside. They move quietly through networks, institutions, and decisions that shape outcomes without announcing themselves. Because sometimes the strongest protection is not dominance. It is invisible, power that looks ordinary, is power that few people try to attack. In every era, society has been fascinated by visible wealth. Large mansions, luxury cars, jewelry that catches the light. These symbols are easy to recognize. They create a simple story. This person is powerful. But appearances can be misleading. The wealth most people see is often only the surface layer of the financial world. A layer designed for attention, admiration, and sometimes even entertainment. Celebrities display it. Influencers perform it. Public figures often embody it. But true financial power frequently moves somewhere else. Behind companies, behind investments, behind institutions that quietly shape economies. Machiavelli understood that power rarely benefits from unnecessary exposure. The more visible a person becomes, the more their influence becomes vulnerable to criticism, competition, and political pressure. Visibility creates friction, and friction slows power down. This is why the loudest displays of wealth are not always the most powerful ones. In many cases, they exist as spectacles, symbols that attract attention while deeper structures remain hidden. A luxury car parked in a driveway is visible, but ownership of the company that manufactures thousands of those cars is far less visible. One generates admiration, the other generates control. The same pattern appears throughout modern society. Public figures represent wealth in ways that people can easily understand. But the individuals who influence markets, industries, and political decisions often remain largely unknown. Their names rarely appear in headlines. Their lives rarely become spectacular, because spectacle is distracting, and distraction has always been useful. When people focus on visible luxury, they often overlook the quieter systems where real influence operates. Machiavelli might have described this as a useful illusion. Let the world watch the theater of wealth, while the deeper mechanisms of power remain out of sight. Because the strongest influence rarely competes for attention. It simply continues shaping the world quietly. Power today rarely looks like it did in the past. Centuries ago, influence was visible. Kings were crowns. Palaces towered above cities. Authority was announced through ceremony and spectacle. But modern power learned something valuable. Visibility creates vulnerability. When power becomes too obvious, it becomes easier to challenge. People can identify it, organize against it, and attempt to replace it. So power evolved. Instead of thrones, it began to operate through systems. Corporations replaced royal courts. Financial institutions replaced royal treasuries. Networks of influence replaced public displays of authority. These structures are quieter, less dramatic, but often far more powerful. A single decision made inside a corporate boardroom can shape entire industries. An investment strategy can quietly redirect billions of dollars across the world. And yet the individuals behind those decisions often remain invisible to the public. Their names rarely become symbols. Their faces rarely appear on screens. Because anonymity creates freedom. The less visible a source of influence becomes, the less emotional resistance it encounters. People tend to resist individuals more easily than systems. A king can be blamed. A palace can be stormed. But a network is far harder to confront. Machiavelli understood the importance of controlling perception long before these modern structures existed. His advice about appearances applies even more strongly today. The quieter power becomes, the longer it survives. Influence that hides inside institutions, investments, and legal frameworks rarely provokes the same emotional reaction as visible authority. And without emotional reaction, resistance struggles to organize itself. So modern power moves differently. It does not announce itself loudly. It moves through agreements, policies, financial structures, and decisions that shape outcomes without drawing attention to the people behind them. This is the shadow where influence thrives, not in secrecy for its own sake, but in subtlety, because power that remains unseen often encounters fewer obstacles. and fewer obstacles allow it to continue moving almost unnoticed. The wealth most people see is often the kind still searching for recognition. It arrives with noise, symbols, and spectacle, signals meant to confirm its presence. But the deeper layers of wealth move differently. They grow quietly. They expand through patience, influence, and structures that rarely draw attention to themselves. Machiavelli understood that power follows a similar pattern. The stronger it becomes, the less it needs to prove itself. A ruler obsessed with displaying wealth often reveals something unintended: insecurity. The desire to be seen can quietly expose the fear of being overlooked. True power rarely carries that fear. It does not rely on spectacle to confirm its existence. Instead, it operates with restraint, a quiet confidence, the kind that understands something ancient about human nature. People react strongly to what they can clearly see. Visible power invites comparison. Visible wealth invites judgment. But subtle influence often passes through society without triggering the emotions that lead to resistance. This is the paradox. The more wealth becomes visible, the more fragile it can become. The more power demands attention, the more attention begins to question it. So the most enduring forms of influence learn to soften their presence, not disappearing completely, but existing just beneath the surface, quiet enough to avoid provoking envy, subtle enough to avoid becoming a target. Across centuries, Machiavelli observed rulers rise and fall within this delicate balance. Some built monuments to their wealth. Others built systems that outlived them. History remembers the monuments, but the systems continue shaping the world long after the monuments fade. And perhaps this is the final truth hidden inside the silence of power. The strongest wealth rarely needs to be seen, because the influence moves quietly, often moves the longest. Subscribe,